The first word in the letter 1 Peter is actually the name Peter, and he purports to be the apostle who was with Jesus. But despite that, there are people who question whether that Peter we know from the Gospels and Acts is the one who actually wrote this letter called 1 Peter. The three basic arguments that are given to deny Peter's authorship is that he was a Galilean fisherman who would not have been able to write in such sophisticated Greek. Secondly, there's the thought that Peter, in general, is simply rehashing Pauline writing, and that it could be someone else writing similarly to the way we see people who have questioned Paul's authorship of the pastoral letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And thirdly, there are those who think that the situation described in Peter's letter is something that happened later in the church's existence when there was empire-wide persecution of the church. So it could not have been written by the historic Peter who died earlier on than the empire-wide persecution. Well, in responding to those concerns, there is evidence that Galileans received pretty good education in Greek, and we're learning more and more about how they were able to function in the Greek language. And there's also the possibility that Peter and other New Testament writers had scribes, had people who could help them in writing their works. Secondly, there is absolutely no reason to think that Peter has borrowed from Paul. There are a few similarities of language. He uses the expression "in Christ," like Paul does. But many scholars acknowledge that there was very likely a common body of Christian language, Christian terminology, Christian ideas that both Peter and Paul borrowed from. And we don't even have to assume that Peter borrowed from Paul. And thirdly, as far as persecution is concerned, the empire-wide persecution did start later in the 1st century and into the 2nd. But Peter doesn't have to be seen as addressing that. It's very likely that the persecution the Christians were facing was more regional and not empire-wide yet. So there's no real reason to question Peter's authorship of the letter. In fact, one thing that might help strengthen the argument that he is indeed the one who wrote the letter is resonances throughout the letter that seem to echo Peter's life with Jesus. One of those is in chapter 5, where Peter talks about aproning oneself with humility. He uses the word for a slave to do menial work. And it seems like a resonance with what happened in the Gospels when Jesus got up and washed his disciples' feet. And while I'm not arguing that there's a formal connection there, it's one of a few places where it seems like the historic Peter is actually the one who's in this text, writing this text. That's the position that I take. I don't find any good reason to deny Peter's authorship of the letter. It seems to be one that he wrote, has his voice in it, even if he got help with the Greek. I think Peter, the apostle we know from the Gospels, wrote 1 Peter.